The buzzing of fluorescent lights echoed through the empty hallways of Elon Musk's old high school. The walls, once filled with the chaos of teenagers rushing between classes, now stood silent, adorned with decades-old trophies and faded school banners. As Elon walked down the familiar yet distant corridors, the memories of his own high school years flooded back, some good, some bad, but all a reminder of how far he had come. He was here today to speak at a special event for students, sharing his journey from a small-town kid to the billionaire CEO of several groundbreaking companies. It was supposed to be a celebration of his success, a motivational talk about how anyone could make it if they just kept pushing forward. But as he moved through the school, there was something else pulling at his attention. A soft, shuffling sound broke the silence coming from the janitor's closet. Elon's eyes flicked toward it, and for a moment he wondered if it was just his mind playing tricks. But then he saw him, a figure hunched over, sweeping the same floor that Elon had walked on as a teenager. The janitor, an elderly man in his 80s, was at work, the same man who had cleaned up after the students, kept the school running behind. "The scenes. Elon Musk, is that you?" The voice was familiar, a bit rough around the edges, but unmistakable. Elon froze, unsure if he had heard the voice correctly. As the janitor straightened up, their eyes met, and for a moment, everything around them seemed to slow down. The man's face was weathered, his hair graying with age, but his eyes, those eyes were full of recognition, as if time had never passed. "Mr. Donnelly?" Elon asked, still not quite believing what he was seeing. The elderly man smiled widely. "Well, I'll be. If it isn't Elon Musk, the boy who used to sit in the back of my class scribbling on his notebook all day." He laughed softly, shaking his head. "I remember you. You used to skip the janitor's closet, not realizing I was always there, watching over the hallways." Elon stood frozen in place. The janitor, Mr. Donnelly, had always been a quiet presence at the school, a man who cleaned up the messes others made but never asked for anything in return. Elon had never thought twice about him back then. Now, seeing him still at work after all these years, something stirred inside him. "You're still here?" Elon asked, his voice tinged with surprise and curiosity. Mr. Donnelly nodded, leaning on his broom. "Yep, still here, sweeping these same floors. Can't say much has changed around here. People come and go, but I've always been here. It's just what I do, and besides, it gives me something to do every day." Elon glanced around the hallway, taking in the dimly lit rooms, the familiar smell of cleaning products in the air. He couldn't help but wonder how long Mr. Donnelly had been doing this. How many years had he spent cleaning up after the students, doing the work that no one else noticed? It seemed strange to him that someone who had worked here for so long, someone who had seen so many generations of students come and go, was still doing the same thing, day after day. "You've been here this whole time?" Elon asked, his tone softer now. He had to know more. Mr. Donnelly shrugged, a faint smile still on his face. "Yeah, been here longer than most of the teachers, I reckon. Sometimes I think this place is the only thing that's kept me going." Elon's mind raced as he thought about everything Mr. Donnelly must have gone through. Here he was, a man in his 80s, still working at a high school in the same role he had when Elon was a student. It didn't sit right with him. Elon had achieved so much. He had revolutionized industries, gone to space, and changed the world, in ways few could ever imagine. But this janitor, this man who had always been there, had never been given a chance to do more. There was a stirring in Elon's chest, a desire to do something, to change this man's life in some way. He had everything he could ever want: money, success, recognition. But in front of him was a man who had spent his life giving, with nothing in return. For a brief moment, the world outside of these hallways seemed to fade away, and Elon thought, what if I could help him? What if I could do something for Mr. Donnelly? "Mr. Donnelly," Elon began, his voice serious now, "I'm not sure what it is, but there's something about seeing you here today that's making me think, what if there's more for you? I don't know what it is yet, but I feel like you deserve more than this." The janitor chuckled, shaking his head. "Oh, don't worry about me, Elon. I've had a good life. I've always been here, and I'm happy with it. You're a busy man. Go on with your talk and let me get back to work. The hallways won't clean themselves." But Elon wasn't convinced. There was something deeper, something that felt wrong about letting Mr. Donnelly just keep sweeping, just keep cleaning, without ever being recognized for what he had done, not only for the school, but for the students who passed through its halls. "Hold on a second, Mr. Donnelly," Elon said, determination in his voice. "I can't just walk away from this. You've been here all these years and no one's given you the recognition you deserve. What if I told you that it's not too late to change everything? What if I could help you do something amazing with all that experience, all that knowledge?" "You have?" Mr. Donnelly looked up at him, puzzled. "What are you talking about, Elon?" "I don't know yet," Elon said, a spark of something igniting in him, "but I think we can figure it out together." As he looked into Mr. Donnelly's eyes, he felt a sudden surge of possibility. The janitor may have been just another face in the crowd for years, but now Elon could see that he was much more than that. There was a story here, a story that had yet to be told, and perhaps, just perhaps, this encounter, this chance meeting in the hallway, was the start of something incredible. But what would it take? The air in the hallway felt thicker now, charged with an unspoken understanding that something was beginning to shift. Elon and Mr. Donnelly stood there, the janitor with his broom in hand, his body stooped with age, but his presence surprisingly strong. Elon felt the weight of the moment. For a man who had achieved so much, the discovery of this humble elderly janitor had rocked him in ways he couldn't fully explain. "So, tell me," Elon said, his curiosity piqued, "what's kept you here all these years?" Mr. Donnelly paused, his wrinkled hand resting on the broom handle. He looked around the familiar hallways, his gaze softening as he took in the place that had been his world for decades. "Well, Elon," he began slowly, his voice carrying a blend of warmth and weariness, "I've been here since I was in my 20s. I came in as a kid just needing a job, you know. My family didn't have much. My father worked 2 jobs and my mum was always sick. So, I did what I had to do." Elon stood still, listening intently. He had known about hardship. Of course. He'd grown up in a modest household, but nothing compared to the sacrifices Mr. Donnelly had made. "I got married right after high school," Mr. Donnelly continued, his voice growing softer, "and we had kids pretty quick. Things weren't easy, but they never are they?" He gave Elon a small smile before looking down at the broom again. "I had to keep working. I couldn't afford college or a different job. I stayed here because this school paid enough to keep the lights on and feed my family. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady." Elon's mind raced. He had been so focused on his own journey that he had never stopped to think about how many others were stuck in jobs they didn't want, without the chance to break free. It was clear Mr. Donnelly wasn't here by choice. He had stayed because it was the only option, a way to survive. "You've had this job for decades, then?" Elon asked. "Why haven't you ever looked for something else?" Mr. Donnelly chuckled lightly, his shoulders slumping. "I tried a few things, but life doesn't always give you the breaks you need. I got laid off once years ago, but that was tough. It was hard finding work after that, especially when you're my age. And after a while, I just figured, well, I was good at this, so I stuck with it." Elon's heart tightened as he realized the gravity of Mr. Donnelly's situation. For years, this man had been quietly toiling away, making do with what he had, never given the opportunity to follow any dreams beyond this school's walls. And yet, despite the sacrifices, there was no sense of bitterness or regret in his voice. Only resignation. Elon felt a rush of conflicting emotions. He had been so lucky. His path to success had been shaped by his intelligence, his drive, and a series of fortunate opportunities. He had been able to take risks, make mistakes, and build a legacy. But here, in front of him, was a man who had never been afforded the luxury of choice. "I wish there was more I could do for you," Elon said, his voice thick with sincerity. "You've worked here your whole life. You deserve more than this. I can help you make a change, give you the life you never got to have." Mr. Donnelly shook his head, a slight laugh escaping him. "You don't need to worry about me, Elon. I'm fine. I've made peace with it. Not everyone can be a billionaire or change the world. Some of us are just here to keep things running, to make sure the kids have a clean place to learn, and I'm okay with that. I've got a good life." "But what if you didn't have to settle?" Elon's words hung in the air, heavy with possibility. "What if there was more waiting for you outside this school? What if I could help you take that step?" Mr. Donnelly's face softened. He seemed to consider Elon's offer, but there was a subtle reluctance in his eyes, as if the idea of change felt foreign and perhaps even too risky. "It's hard to teach an old dog new tricks, Elon. I've been here so long, I don't know if I can just leave it all behind." Elon knew he wasn't just talking about the job. Mr. Donnelly had built his entire life around this school. It was more than just a job. It was his identity, his purpose, and giving that up for something unknown. That was a terrifying thought for anyone, let alone someone who had spent decades in one place. "I get it," Elon said, his voice calming. "Change is scary, but I think you have more to offer than just keeping these halls clean. You've lived a life of quiet resilience, and that's something I admire. I think the world needs to see what you're capable of." Mr. Donnelly chuckled again, but this time there was a hint of disbelief in his laugh. "Elon Musk," he said with a twinkle in his eye. "I appreciate your kind words, but I'm not a man who does big things. I'm just a janitor." The words stung, but Elon refused to back down. "You're not just a janitor," he said, his voice firm. "You're someone who's had a front-row seat to history. You've seen generations of students walk through these halls, heard their dreams, seen their struggles. You have knowledge and experience that no one else has. That's valuable." Mr. Donnelly seemed to think about this for a long moment, then sighed deeply. "I don't know, Elon. I never thought I had much to offer outside these walls." Elon could see the struggle. In his eyes, the hesitation to believe that anything more was possible. But something in Elon stirred, a fierce conviction that Mr. Donnelly's story wasn't over. It was just beginning. "I believe you have more," Elon said with finality, "and I'm going to help you find it." The rest of the afternoon passed, in a blur for Elon. His scheduled speech was successful, with students hanging on every word as he talked about the future, about technology, and about the power of innovation. But his mind kept drifting back to Mr. Donnelly. The elderly janitor hadn't left his thoughts since their conversation in the hallway. As Elon made his way back to his private car after the event, he couldn't help but feel that there was something unfinished, something that called out to him. What if Mr. Donnelly was the key to something bigger than either of them realized? He tapped his fingers on the seat as his car sped away from the high school, the city skyline growing clearer in the distance. Elon knew what it was like to be underestimated. He had been told countless times that his ideas were impossible, that he was crazy to dream so big. But he had also learned something along the way. It wasn't about how others saw you, it was about what you saw in yourself. What could Mr. Donnelly achieve if someone believed in him? The more Elon thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't just about helping a man who had spent his life in the shadows. It was about giving someone the chance to break free from a life that had been defined by limitations, and showing the world that even the quietest of people could leave a mark. The next morning, Elon reached out to his assistant. "I need you to track down Mr. Donnelly's records from the school. His full name is Joseph Donnelly. Get anything that might help me understand more about his life here, and set up a meeting with him, if possible." Back at the school, Mr. Donnelly was already at work, just as he had been for decades. The halls were quiet now that classes were over, the bustling energy of students replaced with a soft hum of cleaning equipment. He wasn't used to interruptions during his cleaning shifts, but when he saw Elon standing in the doorway of the janitor's closet, his heart skipped a beat. "Elon?" Mr. Donnelly asked, looking up from his mop with mild surprise. "What are you doing here?" "I told you I'd be back," Elon said, a determined look on his face. "I've been thinking about our conversation, and I'm here to take the first step toward changing things." Mr. Donnelly wiped his hands on his old work pants, unsure of what Elon meant. "Change? What do you mean by that?" "I've been looking into it," Elon replied. "Your life, your time at this school. I've learned some things, and I think it's time for a new chapter for you." Mr. Donnelly furrowed his brow, confusion spreading across his face. "Look, Elon, I appreciate your kindness, but I've been at this school for so long. This is all I know. I don't think there's any new chapter waiting for me. I'm just a janitor." Elon stepped forward, his voice steady and clear. "That's exactly what I mean. You are more than that. You've been here for decades, seen generations of students, helped shape their lives in ways no one else could. That's a story worth sharing. Mr. Donnelly shifted uneasily, his old hands shaking slightly. I don't know how much of a story there is to tell. It's just been cleaning, you know? Nothing special. I've always just kept my head down and done the work. Elon smiled, seeing the man's humility, but it only fueled his determination. You may think it's nothing special, but what if we could turn it into something that matters? What if your story could inspire others? The janitor took a long breath. He had lived in the shadows for so long that the thought of stepping into the spotlight was overwhelming. I'm not sure I have a story worth telling, Elon. What do I even have to offer? I'm not like you. I'm not some big shot with ideas. That changed the world. Elon didn't back down. You don't have to be like me to make a difference. Your life has been about dedication, resilience, and humility. Those are qualities the world needs, and I think you've got more to offer than just a mop and broom. For a moment, Mr. Donnelly fell silent, his eyes searching the floor as if looking for something that might make sense of what Elon was saying. And what? You think I'm just going to leave all this behind? He gestured vaguely at the school, his life's work. I don't even know what I'd do outside these walls. Elon leaned against the doorframe, his voice softening. That's what I want to help you figure out. What if this place was just the beginning of your story? You've spent all this time giving to others. Maybe it's time to see what you can do for yourself. Mr. Donnelly stood there, lost in thought. It wasn't easy for him to imagine life outside the school. The idea of doing something else, something different, was terrifying. But Elon's words planted a seed, one that had started to sprout slowly but steadily. Maybe, just maybe, it was time for him to take a leap. I don't know, Mr. Donnelly muttered, shaking his head. It's a lot to think about. I know it is, Elon said. But let's start with small steps. I've got some ideas. I think we can build something together. Let's see where it takes us. Mr. Donnelly looked at Elon, his face a mix of uncertainty and curiosity. He had lived his life one way for so long that the thought of change felt almost impossible. But for the first time, a flicker of hope began to spark inside him. Maybe this was the start of something. Maybe this wasn't just about cleaning hallways. It was about making a mark on the world in a way he had never imagined. Well, Mr. Donnelly said slowly, I suppose it wouldn't hurt to hear what you have in mind. Elon smiled, sensing the shift in the air. Good. Let's talk. I think we're going to do something amazing. As they sat down, the world outside seemed to pause for just a moment. For the first time in years, Mr. Donnelly felt like there was something ahead of him, something he couldn't yet see but could feel in his bones. And for Elon, this was just the beginning of what promised to be a powerful and unexpected journey. The next few weeks flew by, each one bringing with it a new challenge and a new idea for what Mr. Donnelly's future might look like. Elon was determined to help the elderly janitor find a new path, but Mr. Donnelly remained hesitant, unsure of what to do with the opportunities being presented to him. At first, they met a few times a week, brainstorming ideas, mapping out plans, and having long conversations about the future. Elon's suggestions ranged from launching a community outreach program to sharing his life story. But each time, Mr. Donnelly grew more and more reluctant. He was a man who had spent decades hidden behind a mop and broom. The thought of standing in front of others, of having a life outside of the school, seemed daunting. I don't even know where to start, Elon, Mr. Donnelly said one afternoon, running a hand through his thinning grey hair. I've never been someone who talks about myself. What could I possibly have to offer that people would want to hear? Elon leaned forward, his eyes intense and full of purpose. It's not about what you think you have to offer, it's about sharing your experiences, your story. You've lived through things most people can't even imagine, and that's something powerful. People connect with realness, Mr. Donnelly. You have something that others can learn from. Mr. Donnelly sat quietly, contemplating Elon's words. He'd lived a quiet, unremarkable life in his eyes, just doing the work day in and day out. He had never seen the value in his own experiences, but Elon was pushing him to see himself in a new light, and that felt both thrilling and terrifying. Just don't know how to get started, Mr. Donnelly admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Elon smiled, his mind already working on the next step. I've been thinking, what if we started small? We'll launch a podcast, just a simple one. Share your stories, your experiences. People will be drawn to you because of your authenticity. Then once you get comfortable, we can take it a step further. Maybe you could write a book or even start giving talks. There's no limit to where this can go. Mr. Donnelly's eyes widened. A podcast? I'm just a janitor, Elon. How am I supposed to run something like that? Anyone can run a podcast, Elon said, a grin spreading across his face. And I'll help you. I'll get everything set up for you, equipment, training, everything. We'll take it one step at a time, and before you know it, you'll be sharing your stories with people all over the world. It seemed impossible. Yet, as Elon spoke, Mr. Donnelly felt something stirring deep inside him. He wasn't just listening to ideas anymore. He was feeling them, imagining what it might be like to step outside of his comfort zone. Maybe this was the beginning of something. A week later, Mr. Donnelly found himself sitting in a small, soundproof studio, the weight of the microphone in front of him making his palms sweat. Elon had arranged for him to meet with a professional podcaster who walked him through the process. The setup was simple, but the idea of broadcasting his voice to strangers made Mr. Donnelly nervous. He had never spoken to a crowd, never shared his thoughts with the world. I'm not sure I can do this, he muttered, staring at the blinking red light on the console. Elon sat next to him, his gaze full of encouragement. You can do it. Just speak from the heart. People will connect with you because you're being honest. Mr. Donnelly took a deep breath, his voice trembling as he spoke into the microphone. Hello, everyone. My name is Joseph Donnelly, and I've worked as a janitor at a high school for more than 50 years. The words felt strange coming out of his mouth. He hadn't shared his story like this before, but as he continued, he began to loosen up. He talked about his childhood, his struggles, his work, and the students he'd seen come and go. He spoke about how he'd always done his best to make the school a better place, even if no one ever noticed. He shared the little things, how he remembered the first student he'd ever helped, how he once made an extra lunch for a kid who couldn't afford one, and how much it meant to him to see the students graduate and go on to change the world. By the end of the first recording session, Mr. Donnelly was exhausted but exhilarated. He had poured out his soul, telling stories that had remained locked inside him for decades. Elon watched from the side, a proud smile on his face. You did it, Elon said, giving him a pat on the back. That was incredible. Mr. Donnelly smiled weakly. It wasn't as bad as I thought. No, Elon said with a chuckle. It was better. People are going to love it. The first episode of Mr. Donnelly's podcast, Lessons from the Janitor, went live a few weeks later. It wasn't polished, it wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that's exactly what people needed. Within days, the podcast gained traction. People were drawn to Mr. Donnelly's humble nature, his ability to speak truthfully about his life. His followers grew steadily as listeners shared his podcast with friends and family, inspiring others to see the value in their own stories. Mr. Donnelly couldn't believe it. For the first time, he felt like he was doing something that mattered, something that was truly his. As the podcast grew in popularity, he found himself reaching out to schools, offering to share his story with students who might be struggling with their own sense of purpose. He was invited to give talks, to speak about resilience, about the power of simple acts of kindness. One day, while he was giving a talk at a local high school, something happened that would change everything. A student approached him afterward, her eyes bright with excitement. Mr. Donnelly, she said, you have no idea how much your story means to me. I've been feeling lost, like I don't have a future. But hearing you talk about your life, your struggles, it's made me realize that I can keep going. You've inspired me. For the first time in his life, Mr. Donnelly realized the full impact of his story. He wasn't just a janitor anymore. He was a mentor, a voice of hope for others. Elon watched all of this unfold from behind the scenes, his heart swelling with pride. Mr. Donnelly had found his path, his new purpose, and it was bigger than anything Elon could have imagined. The world was listening now, and it was just the beginning. It wasn't long before the world began to take notice of Mr. Donnelly's podcast and the powerful message he was spreading. The once quiet janitor had gone from being a background character in the halls of a high school to becoming a public figure whose story resonated with people from all walks of life. The podcast was now a sensation, and his speaking engagements were booked for months in advance. But with success came pressure. Mr. Donnelly's new life wasn't easy, far from it. Each new interview, each new audience, brought with it an overwhelming sense of responsibility. People were reaching out to him for advice, for inspiration, and even for guidance on their own struggles. The weight of it all began to take its toll on him. He was no longer the humble janitor in the background, but a man at the forefront of a movement. One morning as he sat in his office, a small, cluttered room in the high school where he had once worked, he found himself staring at the screen of his laptop, reading through a flurry of messages and emails. They all spoke of the same thing, how his story had changed their lives. Yet, despite the overwhelming outpouring of gratitude, Mr. Donnelly couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. For the first time since he'd started his journey, doubt began to creep into his mind. "I'm just an old man who cleaned. Flaws," he whispered to himself. How could any of this matter? His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. "Elon," Mr. Donnelly said, surprised to see his old friend and mentor standing in the doorway. Elon walked in, a smile on his face, but there was a trace of concern in his eyes. "Hey, I thought I'd drop by and see how you were doing. I've been watching your interviews. The podcast is amazing, Mr. Donnelly. You're changing lives." Mr. Donnelly smiled weakly, his heart not quite in it. "I don't know, Elon. Lately it feels like everything is moving so fast, and I don't know if I'm ready for it. I didn't ask for any of this. It's just too much." Elon's smile faded. "I get it. You've gone from being in the background to being the one everyone's looking to for answers. It's a lot. But you're doing something incredible. You're helping people who never thought they had a chance," Mr. Donnelly sighed, rubbing his temples. "I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this. I'm not meant to be a speaker or an influencer. I've spent my life cleaning up after others, not standing in the spotlight." Elon sat down across from him, his voice soft but firm. "What you've done, what you've already done, has already had more impact than most people will ever achieve in their lives, and you're not in this alone. You've got me. I believe in you, Joseph. This isn't just about the podcast or the speaking gigs. It's about your message. You've been given a voice, and now it's time to use it." Mr. Donnelly's eyes welled up with tears, but he quickly wiped them away, embarrassed by the sudden rush of emotion. "But what if I fail? What if all of this was just a mistake?" Elon placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's okay to be scared, but failure isn't the worst thing that can happen. It's letting that fear control you that stops you from moving forward. I'm not going anywhere, Mr. Donnelly. We're in this together." For a long moment, they both sat in silence. Mr. Donnelly's mind raced, and in that stillness, he felt a deep sense of clarity. For all his doubts, he knew deep down that what he was doing mattered. It had to matter. And if it helped just one person, if it helped himself, then it was worth every second of the struggle. Finally, Mr. Donnelly spoke, his voice steadier now. "All right, I'll keep going. I'll keep sharing my story. I don't know what comes next, but I'll trust that it's meant to be." Elon smiled, a look of pride on his face. "That's the spirit. You're stronger than you realize, Joseph. You've already done more than you could have imagined." With renewed determination, Mr. Donnelly continued to record more episodes, each one more heartfelt than the last. The world continued to respond, and as he shared more of his story, he realized something profound. He wasn't just inspiring others. He was finally coming to terms with his own legacy. One evening, just before recording a new episode, Mr. Donnelly received a phone call that would change everything. It was from a major publisher interested in turning his story into a book. Book. He stared at the phone, disbelief written across his face. Was this really happening? "Elon," he called, rushing into the next room where his friend was waiting. "You won't believe this. They want me to write a book." Elon's face lit up. "That's incredible, Joseph. I knew this was just the beginning. This is your chance to leave a permanent mark on the world. A book. Your story will be remembered forever." Mr. Donnelly could hardly believe it, but the excitement bubbling inside him was undeniable. A book. His story, his lessons, immortalized in pages for the world to read. It was more than he ever dreamed possible. As the call ended, Mr. Donnelly sat back, his heart racing. For so long he had thought that his life was insignificant. He had been just a janitor, an invisible figure whose work was unnoticed. But now, in a way he never expected, he was about to leave behind something much bigger than a clean floor or a tidy classroom. He was going to leave behind a legacy. The emotional weight of it all hit him suddenly, and tears filled his eyes once again. But this time, they weren't tears of doubt. They were tears of gratitude, of understanding. This journey had been difficult, yes, but it had also been the most rewarding thing he had ever done. And as he looked toward the future, he realized that he had finally found his true calling, and in that moment Mr. Donnelly knew that he had already won. As the months went by, Mr. Donnelly's life changed in ways he never could have imagined. The podcast continued to grow in popularity, reaching millions of listeners across the globe. His book, Lessons from the Janitor, was published and quickly became a bestseller. He was invited to appear on television, on popular talk shows, and in interviews where he shared his wisdom, his struggles, and his triumphs. The world had truly embraced the once quiet janitor turned inspirational figure. But as the spotlight grew brighter, so did the weight of the expectations placed on him. Mr. Donnelly found himself balancing between the pressures of his new life as a public figure and the quiet man he once was, the man who only wanted to serve others in the shadows. It wasn't easy. There were moments when he felt like he was losing himself in the noise. The demands of book signings, podcasts, and speaking engagements took a toll on him, physically and emotionally. He found himself longing for the simpler days, when all he had to worry about was making sure the floors were clean. But through it all, there was one constant: his purpose. The students, the people who reached out to him, and the letters that poured in from listeners across the world reminded him why he had started this journey in the first place. He wasn't just sharing his story for the sake of fame or recognition. He was doing it because his story had the power to help others who were struggling, just as he once had. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling week of interviews and events, Mr. Donnelly sat alone in a quiet cafe. The weight of everything was heavy on his shoulders, and he could feel the exhaustion setting in. It was then that he received a letter from someone he had never met, a letter that would change everything. The letter was from a young woman named Lucy, who had recently graduated high school. In her letter, she thanked Mr. Donnelly for sharing his story. She told him how just a year ago she had been at a crossroads in her life, struggling with depression, unsure of her future. She felt invisible, like no one understood her pain. But after listening to his podcast and reading his book, she realized that she wasn't alone. Lucy wrote that his words had given her the strength to keep going, to take control of her life and pursue her dreams. She was now studying to become a social worker, inspired by Mr. Donnelly's kindness and resilience. Reading Lucy's letter brought tears to Mr. Donnelly's eyes. It was a moment of clarity. For all the doubt, for all the fear and the exhaustion, moments like this made it all worthwhile. He had helped someone. He had made a difference in a person's life. As the weight of the letter sank in, Mr. Donnelly realized something profound. The impact he had on the world wasn't measured by the number of interviews, the accolades, or the fame. It was measured by the difference he made in individual lives, and that, he realized, was what truly mattered. Later that night, Mr. Donnelly sat down with Elon over a cup of coffee, reflecting on the journey they had been on together. "You know," Mr. Donnelly began, "I was always afraid of stepping out of the shadows. I thought that my life would never be anything significant, but I've come to realize that it's not about what I've done for myself. It's about what I've done for others." Elon smiled, his eyes gleaming with pride. "That's the lesson, Joseph. It's always been about helping others. That's why your story resonates. It's not about being famous. It's about making a difference, one person at a time." Mr. Donnelly nodded, the weight of his realization settling in. "I've learned more about myself through this journey than I ever could have imagined. I'm not just the janitor anymore. I'm someone who can inspire others, who can help them find their way." Elon's smile deepened. You always had that inside you. You just needed the courage to see it. And look at what you've done. You've shown the world that it's never too late to change, to find your purpose, and to make a difference. That's something most people never find. Mr. Donnelly looked out the window, reflecting on all that had happened, the challenges, the triumphs, and the incredible journey he had been on. He had started as a humble janitor, never expecting his life to take such a dramatic turn, but now he knew that everything had happened for a reason. Every hardship, every moment of doubt, had led him to this place of understanding. He thought about the people he had met, the lives he had touched, and the stories he had shared. The most important thing he had learned was that life wasn't about status, about how much you had, or how many people knew your name. It was about the impact you made, the love, the kindness, and the change you brought into the world. As he sat back, a sense of peace washed over him. The journey wasn't over. There were still more stories to share, more lives to touch, and that was enough. "I guess," Mr. Donnelly said with a soft smile, "it's never too late to make a difference." Elon raised his cup in a silent toast to never being too late. And in that quiet moment, with the weight of the world now feeling like a lighter burden, Mr. Donnelly knew that he had found his true purpose. Mr. Donnelly's life had been forever altered. What began as a simple podcast had now turned into a global movement. Everywhere he went, people recognized him, not as a janitor but as a symbol of resilience, of the power of transformation, and the strength that comes from embracing one's purpose. Yet as his influence continued to grow, so did his sense of responsibility. Elon continued to support him, always there with a word of encouragement and advice, but Mr. Donnelly's sense of fulfillment came from seeing the world he had once believed to be indifferent, now alive with energy. People had found themselves in his story, and that was his greatest reward. Despite the growing pressure of his public persona, Mr. Donnelly felt a renewed connection to his roots. He would always be that janitor, the one who swept the floors, fixed the broken lockers, and made sure the hallways were spotless. That man had been overlooked, forgotten, and underestimated, but he had also been stronger than anyone had ever realized. One evening, after a long day of speaking at a charity event, Mr. Donnelly received a text message from Lucy, the young woman whose letter had changed everything. Her words were simple, but they struck him in a way that he couldn't ignore. "I just wanted to tell you that I graduated with honors today. I've been accepted into the social work program at the university. None of this would have been possible without you. You showed me what's possible when we stop believing the lies we tell ourselves. Thank you for everything." As he read her message, tears welled up in his eyes. Not because of pride, but because in that moment he understood something that had eluded him until now. His story had created a ripple effect. Lucy was just one of the many lives he had touched, but she had taken what he had shared and turned it into something remarkable. She had found her purpose, and in doing so she had become a beacon for others. Mr. Donnelly could now see that his work was far from over. The book tours and speaking engagements had been incredible, but they were just the beginning. He had to do more. He had to build something lasting, something that would continue even after he was gone. It was time to create a foundation, a place where young people, those who had once felt overlooked and hopeless, could find the guidance, support, and inspiration they needed to realize their potential. He would create scholarships, mentorship programs, and workshops to help those who were struggling to find their own path. The idea took root quickly, and within months, the Donnelly Foundation was born. With Elon's help and the support of many others who had believed in him from the beginning, Mr. Donnelly's vision began to take shape. But as the foundation grew, so did the challenges. There were moments when the weight of it all felt unbearable. The logistics, the fundraising, the tireless work to ensure that every program was effective, it was exhausting. Mr. Donnelly often found himself questioning whether he had the strength to keep going. One evening, after yet another sleepless night spent reviewing paperwork, Mr. Donnelly sat at his desk, staring at the empty chair across from him. He missed his quiet life, the simple days of cleaning the floors and sweeping away the dust. The world seemed so much more complicated. Now, as he sat there, lost in thought, a knock on the door interrupted his musings. Elon stepped in, his face lighting up when he saw his friend. "Hey, what's going on? You look like you've been working non-stop," Elon remarked, walking over and sitting in the chair across from Mr. Donnelly. "I'm not sure how much longer I can keep up, Elon," Mr. Donnelly admitted, running a hand through his hair. "The foundation is growing, but so are the challenges. It's like I'm running a marathon, and I don't know if I have the energy to cross the finish line." Elon gave him a thoughtful look. "It's okay to feel overwhelmed. You're doing something incredible, and it's natural to feel the weight of it, but you don't have to do it alone." Mr. Donnelly looked at him, a small smile forming on his lips. "I know, I have you, and I have the foundation, our foundation, but I can't shake the feeling that I've lost sight of the bigger picture. I started this to help people, but now it feels like just a job." Elon nodded. "Maybe you need to take a step back. Remember why you started this in the first place. It's about the people. It's about making a difference. Don't lose sight of the heart of it." The words hit Mr. Donnelly deeply. As much as he had become consumed by the logistics of running the foundation, he had forgotten the one thing that had always driven him, the people whose lives had been changed, the ones who needed him. That night, Mr. Donnelly took some time off from the foundation and returned to his roots. He went to a local school where he had once worked and stood in the empty hallways, just as he had years ago. The sound of his footsteps echoed in the quiet space, a reminder of the man he had been. He realized then that his story had come full circle. He wasn't just the janitor anymore. He was a teacher, a mentor, a guide. His journey had not just been about overcoming obstacles, but about helping others to do the same. In the weeks that followed, Mr. Donnelly refocused his energy. He wasn't just about running a foundation. He was about touching lives. The events, the media, the book, tours and the interviews were secondary. What mattered most was the real-world impact he could make. And that impact wasn't just about giving away money or providing scholarships. It was about offering people hope and showing them that change was possible, no matter how old, no matter how ordinary they might feel. The Donnelly Foundation continued to grow, but now it had a deeper sense of purpose. It wasn't just about programs and numbers. It was about the people, the stories that were being rewritten with every life touched. Mr. Donnelly knew that his work would never truly be done, but he was at peace with that. He had found his place in the world, and that was more than he had ever imagined possible. And as he sat down one quiet evening to write the final chapter of his next book, he knew that the greatest lesson he could leave behind was this: it's never too late to start. It's never too late to make a difference. As the years passed, Mr. Donnelly's foundation continued to flourish. The Donnelly Foundation was no longer just a symbol of hope. It had become a force of change. With each passing year, thousands of young people found their way through its doors, each story more inspiring than the last. Scholarships were awarded, mentorship programs flourished, and workshops turned into life-changing experiences. What had started as a quiet vision of a janitor turned global figure was now an institution, one that was molding the future by helping young people see their potential. Mr. Donnelly had found peace in his work, knowing that his efforts were truly making a difference. But even with all the success, a part of him still felt that old sense of humility, the janitor who had once walked the hallways alone, thinking he had nothing to offer. That version of himself was still a part of him, and he held it close. It grounded him, reminded him of how far he had come, and kept him focused on what truly mattered. One cold winter's day, as he was walking to his office, he received a call that would change the course of his future once more. It was Elon. "Joseph," Elon began, his voice tinged with excitement, "I've been thinking. We've done something incredible together, but I think there's one more thing we need to do." Mr. Donnelly raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What's that?" Elon paused for a moment before continuing. "I want to take the foundation global. It's time for your message to spread to the rest of the world, to countries that need hope, to kids who are struggling. You've already made a huge impact in the United States, but it's time to take this beyond our borders." Mr. Donnelly stood still for a moment, his mind racing. The idea of expanding the foundation to a global level seemed overwhelming. Yet deep down he knew Elon was right. The world needed hope, and he had the tools to provide it. More importantly, he had the experience and wisdom to lead others toward their own transformation, just as he had once been led. "I never thought I'd be doing something like this," Mr. Donnelly admitted, his voice soft. "But I'm ready, Elon. I think it's time to take that leap." And so, the plans began. Over the next year, the Donnelly Foundation underwent a major transformation. With Elon's support and the help of his ever-growing team, they created an international initiative that would see the foundation's work touch countless lives around the world. The mission was simple: to inspire people to believe in themselves no matter where they came from, and to provide the resources and mentorship they needed to thrive. The foundation expanded into Europe, Asia, and Africa, touching cities and villages where hope had been in short supply. They helped children in war-torn countries, refugees seeking asylum, and young people in underprivileged communities who had long felt forgotten. Mr. Donnelly's story, which had once seemed like the tale of an ordinary janitor, was now reaching people on a global scale. The team organized international conferences, workshops, and mentorship programs, empowering leaders and communities to continue the work he had started. Young people from different countries began sharing their own stories of resilience and transformation, and soon, the Donnelly effect became a well-known term, symbolizing the power of hope and hard work to change the course of a life. But even as the foundation expanded, Mr. Donnelly remained humble. He wasn't looking for recognition, and he certainly didn't want fame. His joy came from seeing others find their own strength, watching them overcome the obstacles that had once seemed insurmountable. One day, during an event in Johannesburg, South Africa, Mr. Donnelly found himself on stage, speaking to an audience of thousands. The energy in the air was electric, with young faces looking up at him, filled with hope and expectation. He smiled as he looked out over the crowd. The journey had been long, and there were days when he doubted whether he could keep going. But, standing there in that moment, he realized something incredible. The journey had been worth every step. And it wasn't just his journey, it was the collective journey of everyone who had ever believed in him, supported him, and worked with him to build this movement. Mr. Donnelly took a deep breath and began to speak, his voice steady and clear. "When I started this journey, I never imagined that I would be standing here today, sharing this moment with you all. I was just a janitor, an invisible figure in a school. But what I learned along the way is this: no one is ever truly invisible. We all have a purpose, and sometimes all it takes is one person to believe in you to change everything." The crowd erupted in applause, but Mr. Donnelly's thoughts drifted back to the beginning, to the janitor he had once been, the man who had thought his life was unimportant. That man had started something incredible, something that would now live on long after he was gone. That evening, as he sat in his hotel room, he reflected on everything he had learned. He had learned that it's never too late to change, to find purpose and to make a difference. He had learned that our greatest strength lies in our ability to lift others up, to show them that their stories matter, and perhaps most importantly, he had learned that no matter how far he had come, it was the small moments, the quiet acts of kindness, the unnoticed moments of change, that truly made life meaningful. But as he gazed out the window at the glowing city below, one thought stood out above all the others. His legacy was not just about the foundation or the global movement he had started. It was about the lives that had been transformed, the hope that had been sparked, and the belief that anyone, no matter their starting point, could create a new beginning. The journey was far from over. Years had passed since the Donnelly Foundation expanded internationally. The movement had touched millions of lives across the globe, from remote villages in Africa to bustling cities in Europe and Asia. It had sparked a revolution of hope, self-belief, and transformation, just as Mr. Donnelly had envisioned. The Ma Foundation, now a household name, stood as a testament to the power of resilience and the strength of the human spirit. Mr. Donnelly was no longer just a janitor turned philanthropist. He was a leader, a mentor, a figurehead for all those who had been told they were not enough. Yet despite his incredible success, he remained deeply grounded in the values that had started him on this journey: humility, compassion, and the unwavering belief in the power of one person to make a difference. As he sat on the porch of his cabin one evening, surrounded by nature and silence, he felt a sense of peace he had never known before. The world had changed because of the work he had done, but the changes in himself were the most profound of all. He had learned to embrace his flaws, accept his imperfections, and recognize the greatness in others, even when they couldn't see it in themselves. His phone buzzed, on the table next to him, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from Elon. "Joseph, you've done it. You've changed the world. But now it's time for the next step. I think we need to write a book together, your story and how the foundation grew. We need to make sure that the legacy lives on." Mr. Donnelly smiled at the message. He had never been interested in fame or accolades, but Elon was right. This wasn't just about him. It was about the movement, the people, and the future. Within weeks, they began working on the book, The Donnelly Effect. One life, one purpose, endless possibilities. It was a culmination of everything he had learned, his personal struggles, his rise from janitor to global philanthropist, and the incredible transformations that had taken place thanks to the foundation. The book was a call to action for everyone, regardless of their background, to step up and create change in their own lives and in the lives of others. The book was a massive success. It not only shared his journey, but also featured countless stories of those whose lives had been changed by the Donnelly Foundation. Each chapter inspired readers to believe in themselves, to take action, and to push through the darkest of times, knowing that a brighter future was always within reach. Soon, the Foundation's work went beyond mentorship and financial support. They launched educational programs, created sustainable businesses in underserved communities, and set up global community centers where people could learn new skills and work together to create a better future. As his 80th birthday approached, Mr. Donnelly found himself reflecting once again on the journey that had brought him here. It seemed impossible that the shy, humble janitor from a small town in America could have created something so monumental. But in the quiet moments, he understood that it wasn't about his individual greatness. It was about the collective strength of the people who had joined him in this journey, those who had believed in the power of possibility, just as he had. On his birthday, a global celebration was held in his honor. Leaders from around the world, young people whose lives had been changed by the Foundation, and even strangers who had been touched by his story, gathered together in a grand celebration of everything they had accomplished. But as the night wore on, Mr. Donnelly found himself slipping away from the crowd, seeking solace in a quiet corner. The noise, the lights, the applause, it all seemed so surreal. In that moment, he thought about the janitor he had once been, the quiet man who had believed that his life would amount to nothing, the man who had been invisible. But now, as he looked around, he realized he wasn't invisible at all. His life, his story, had touched more people than he could have ever imagined. He had given them hope, a glimpse of what was possible. He had shown them that even in the darkest times, there was always a way forward, a path toward greatness no matter how unlikely. It was in that moment, as he stood alone in the shadows, that he understood the true legacy he had created. It wasn't about the programs or the foundation. It wasn't about the media attention or the global reach. It was about the people, the young men and women, the families, the communities that had found their voices because he had shown them the power of their own story. He was ready now, ready to leave behind his work, his legacy, knowing that it would continue to grow, evolve, and inspire. The world had changed because of him, but more importantly, it had changed because of everyone who had joined him on this journey. As the celebration wound down, Mr. Donnelly made his way back to the crowd, greeted by warm embraces and congratulatory messages. He smiled, but his heart was at peace. The journey had been incredible, and now it was time to pass the torch to the next generation of leaders, dreamers, and changemakers. One of the young women who had been mentored by the Foundation approached him. Her name was Mia, and she was now a successful entrepreneur, helping other young women start their own businesses. She smiled brightly and said, "Joseph, I just wanted to thank you. You've shown me what's possible, and now I want to do the same for others." Mr. Donnelly felt a lump in his throat as he hugged her. This was it. This was the legacy he had always hoped for. Not just the foundation, but the ripple effect that would continue long after he was gone. The final chapter of his journey had come, and he could say with certainty that the world was a better place because he had lived. His story wasn't over. It had just begun a new chapter in the hearts of those he had inspired. And as he looked out at the faces of those who had gathered to honor him, he knew one thing for sure. When we believe in ourselves and in each other, anything is possible.